Hello everyone, welcome back to Bryan's Mysteries and Adventures on Trail. Today's video we are going to be talking about two disappearances, murder, mystery. This story happened over 100 years ago, so there has been several books written about it, hundreds of articles, papers. One thing is that no one seems to agree and both cases are still unsolved. So what I've tried to do is go back through all these records and I'm going to try and present to you actual facts that I could find based on land certificates, birth and death certificates, police records, various witness statements, things of that nature. Unfortunately, like I said, since there's been so many articles, papers, books written about this over the years due to speculation, sensationalism, hearsay, gossip, all of these things have in ways distorted a lot of the information. But like I said, I'm going to try and present to you what I found to be actual facts of this case. The case is most commonly known as the Wonnangatta Station Murders. As always, I will have all my photo credits, sources, everything in the description if you'd like to do further reading or research, as well as many books listed that have been written about this case. Sadly, in 1957, the site was destroyed by bushwalkers by a fire that consumed the entire station. All that remains now is the stone bricks and outline of where it once sat. The Wonnangatta Station was a cattle station located in the remote valley of the Victorian Alps in Australia. According to writer Harry Stevenson, the station, while it was in operation, was the most isolated homestead in Victoria. The station was originally established in the 1860s by an American by the name of Oliver Smith, who came across this valley while he was prospecting for gold. At some point, he became involved with a woman named Ellen, who sometimes went by Nancy. She had a son named Harry, who was from her first marriage to a man by the name of George Hayes. He constructed this homestead that was built near the junction of the Wonnangatta River and the Conglomerate Creek. The creek was then known as Home Creek. He also continued to build sheds, fencing, brought in dairy cattle, and basically transitioned from gold mining to being a cattle rancher. He became very well established despite the fact that he was technically squatting on the property, the fact that there were other people that actually held the official pastoral license. We know this because on his son John's birth certificate in October of 1869, Oliver wrote that he was a squatter on the Wonnangatta Station. Two men by the name of Duke and Nixon were the actual license holders, but they found it to be too isolated. The men just basically surrendered their license. We know that in 1870, he took on a partner by the name of John William Pender Bryce. Mr. Bryce had been working with Oliver for a couple of years, delivering different things to Oliver, as well as taking their goods and produce and selling them to the various gold miners. Sadly, in 1872, Oliver's common-law wife Ellen died during childbirth. This happened inside the station while she was giving birth to twin girls, Mary and Melinda. There was no doctor present, but there was a midwife. Sadly, both the girls died roughly 5 days later. Shortly thereafter, Oliver sold out completely to the Bryce family. Mr. Bryce and his partner Hannah, who went by Annie, continued to build up the station. They had a total of 10 kids, most of which that grew up within the station. They were the sole occupants for 40 years between 1872 until 1914, when Hannah died at the age of 78. This is when two partners, Jeff Ritchie and Arthur Phillips, purchased the station and owned it for the next 5 years. They lived in Manfield and did not want to live at the property. They hired a man by the name of James Barkley, who always went by Jim, so in this video we'll be calling him Jim. Pictured here, this is right before he took up the job as manager of the station. Jim Barkley's parents had immigrated to the area from Scotland in 1860. On February 18th of 1869, Jim Barkley was born. He had 3 siblings, 2 sisters, and a brother, John, who he was very close to. Jim did a little hell raising as a kid, but nothing really serious. In 1883, he left school with a certificate of being sufficiently educated. He went back to his homestead, which was called Heroville, because his father had been a fisherman and his boat was called Hero. So after completing the homestead, the father decided to name it Heroville. He worked there until 1886 when he caught the gold rush fever and traveled north, where for the next 9.5 years he spent in the Mansfield area, sometimes traveling towards Mount Buller to try and find new gold fields or prospecting opportunities. Not having much luck, by 1897 he was more into sheep herding and various other odd jobs that he could get in and around the area. In the next 10 years, he had leased some land in the Wonnangatta Valley area, trading cattle. He'd become an experienced bushman. This really became his passion. Then in 1910, Jim Barkley met and married 19-year-old Lizzie Contini. They got married on December 23rd of 1910 in a very small ceremony. None of Jim's family came because he didn't invite them, possibly due to the fact that Lizzie was already 7 months pregnant. Their son was born on February 22nd, 1911 in Mansfield, given the name James. However, everyone knew him as young Jim. Tragically, only 7 months later, Lizzie died of tuberculosis on September 18, 1911. Jim Barkley, being stricken with grief, he had young Jim go live with his Aunt Molly and Jack Campbell in 1914. Prior to this, in 1912, was when Jim Barkley first visited the station in Wonnangatta Valley. He not only helped the Bryce family with their cattle training, but he also did contract work for Arthur Phillips, the owner at the time of Glenroy Station in Mansfield. This is why by the time Arthur Phillips had become a joint owner of the Wonnangatta Station, he knew he wanted Jim Barkley to manage and run the station. In mid-April of 1915, Jim Barkley became the official manager of Wonnangatta Station. Due to its isolated area, he quickly became friends with his closest neighbor, this man, Harry Smith. Harry Smith used to be Henry Hayes, Oliver Smith's stepson, the original owner of the property. Jim Barkley was in his mid-40s at the time. Harry Smith was in his late 50s. He would often ride into the town of Talbotville to pick up Jim Barkley's mail and any other supplies Jim may have needed. During these trips up to the station, Harry would usually stay a night or two, helping out Jim with whatever he needed. Harry was obviously very familiar with the land and area. He had spent many years of his youth living in that station, and like I said, these two men became very fast friends. The only other company Jim Barkley had was his beloved dog, Bryan. By 1917, he had talked Arthur Phillips into letting him hire somebody to help out with the cooking and odd jobs around the station because it was becoming too unmanageable. Unfortunately, due to World War I still raging in Europe, finding good labor was very difficult, and he was having a hard time finding someone. He then met English-born John Branford, who had been living in the Black Snake Creek area, which is roughly 19 kilometers or 12 miles from the town of Talbotville. We don't have a lot of information on John Branford. What we do know is that he was very different than Jim Barkley. He was quick-tempered. He liked to debate people. Albert Stout, the storekeeper in Talbotville, warned Jim Barkley that if you're going to hire this guy, do not get drawn into any arguments or debates with him because he will just fly off the handle. Despite this, he was hired, and the various stockmen that visited the station in December of that year said that the men seemed to get along very well. The two men went to Talbotville on December 20th of 1917 to vote in the Australian reinforcement referendum, basically what we have here in the US as the Selective Service Act. It is unclear which way the two men voted, but it is thought that they were both in agreement on their votes and voted the same way. After voting, they stayed the night with Albert Stout, the storekeeper. The next morning, December 21st, 1917, they got up early and headed back to the Wonnangatta Station. This was the last time either man was seen alive. On January 22nd of 1918, Harry Smith went up for one of his routine visits. When he got there with Barkley's mail, he tied up his horse and noticed that neither of the gentlemen's horses were there. Approaching the house, he saw written on the front door in chalk, quote, "Home tonight." He went inside, looked around. He noticed the dog Bryan was not there. He also noticed that the hall door leading to the bedrooms was locked. Nothing seemed to be out of place. Harry also noticed that the crops had been cut. He put the mail on the table and decided to stay a couple nights. However, after the second night and still no one showing up, Harry Smith left on January 24th, 1918, went back to his place in Eaglevale. February 14th, 1918, Harry Smith returns to Wonnangatta Station. The note was still on the door. The mail was exactly where he left it. This time, though, he saw the dog Baryan. The dog seemed hungry and neglected, something he knew Jim would never have let happen. Thelma, the horse that John Branford had, was missing. He looked around a little bit more, but left early the next morning for Dargo, taking the dog with him. An emergency telegraph was sent to both owners, Jeff Ritchie and Arthur Phillips, stating that there was something wrong at the station and that Jim Barkley was missing. This next part, there's some debate on the actual date, but roughly on February 21st of 1918, Arthur Phillips and Jack Jebb went to the Wonnangatta Station. They found no one. February 23rd, both Phillips and Jebb arrived at Harry Smith's place asking for help and to ride back to the station to help look for Jim. February 24th, 1918, all three men returned to Wonnangatta Station. They searched extensively. They find nothing, decide to stay in the night, and resume the search the next day. The next morning, they got going and continued a prolonged search. Sadly, around roughly 420 paces from the home, they found Jim Barkley's badly decomposing body buried in a shallow grave next to the conglomerate creek. This is a picture of the actual creek and the time and area of where he was found. From the scattered pieces of clothing, a tobacco pouch, and a belt, Harry Smith was able to identify it as being Jim Barkley. At this point, Arthur Phillips returned to Mansfield and informed the police. Then from Melbourne, Detective Alex McCarroll was sent out together with his constable Ryan. They had grown up in the district and had very good knowledge of the area. They arrived at Wonnangatta Station on March 2nd of 1918. During their investigation, they discovered that Jim's shotgun was found in his bedroom and both barrels had recently been discharged. One empty cartridge was found on the floor. There also appeared to be drag marks leading from Jim's room out the front door. They also discovered that Jim's razor, his handgun, a nice suit of clothes were all missing. Plus, they discovered 19 check butts that had been torn out of his checkbook. They were never found and still haven't been found, and this remains a mystery as to why it was done in the first place. Jim's remains were taken to the Mansfield Hospital for the post-mortem. During this trip back to Mansfield, they came across Thelma, John Bamford's horse running wild without a saddle or bridle in the high plains. The post-mortem found that Jim Barkley had been murdered by a shotgun blast in the back and had been dead for several weeks at the time of the discovery of his body. The inquest that followed, Detective McCarroll said, quote, "I am of the opinion that Barkley and Bamford had an argument over working matters, and that John loaded the gun, shot Barkley. He then removed his working clothes and dressed himself in Mr. Barkley's suit, which is missing, saddled his horse, and after dragging the deceased to the creek, then rode away on his horse." The verdict of the inquest was murder by person or persons unknown. At that time, the media, most police, and most people in the area believed that John Bamford was the assailant. Jim's body was given back to his extended family, and he was buried in the Tyabb Cemetery in Hastings on March 9th, 1918. Jim Barkley was 48 years old at the time of his death. A massive statewide search was now underway for basically John Bamford because everyone thought he was the obvious suspect. The government was offering a £200 reward for anybody with any information regarding Jim Barkley's case. Then on March 11th of 1918, this man came forward claiming to be Bamford. He said that he was responsible. He was taken to Melbourne. Once Constable Hayes saw him, he knew that it wasn't Bamford because he knew Bamford personally. It turned out to be this guy named John Baker who was just a vagrant and was suffering from delusions. The search continued, but as the winter months came on, it made the search more and more difficult. In early of November of 1918, Constable Hayes with Harry Smith William Hearn and Jim Fry. Those latter two men were the people that were running the station now that Jim and John were both gone. They were searching the Mount Hawat area because, according to what everyone says, Harry Smith had dreamed that John Bamford would be found there. Lo and behold, on that search, right as they were about to start turning back, William Hearn thought he saw something right near the Hawat Plains hut. He thought he saw some boots protruding from a pile of logs, so they went in for a further look. Under the pile and partially covered by snow, they found John Bamford. He was taken to Dargo, and during his post-mortem, it was discovered that he was killed by a bullet wound to the head. Even after this, he was still considered the main suspect. People thought that he may have been the one that shot Jim Barkley, and someone that was good friends with Jim Barkley was out seeking revenge, and that's how he ended up. Of course, once this theory was spread around, police suspicion automatically fell on Harry Smith because he was good friends with Jim Barkley. He did have this mysterious dream predicting where John would be found. There was never any direct evidence of this. He was never charged. Police did go out and question him. They took his gun and shot it into a tree to retrieve the caliber bullet, maybe possibly to prove his innocence. And it wasn't the right caliber. It wasn't even the same type of gun. At this point, there are so many theories about what happened. One theory is that both men were killed by cattle thieves. In Wally Mortimer's book, The History of the Wonnangatta Station, page 75, he states that Bob Ritchie, son of Jeffrey Ritchie, one of the owners at the time, states that he remembers when the cattle station was sold, the numbers of cattle had been halved due to a snow blizzard and constant attacks by various cattle thieves. In Keith Layden and Michael Ray's book, The Wonnangatta Mystery, they believe that this bush poet, Billy Y, was responsible, believing that he was this notorious cattle thief at the time. Another theory blames Jim Barkley, saying that he was this big-time ladies' man and that he had an affair with some guy's wife, and this guy was out for revenge, and John Bamford just happened to get caught in the middle of it. There are so many books and articles and letters out there. It depends on which one you read. I will say this. Right before this all happened, Jim wrote a letter to his brother, John, and in this letter he said, quote, "I wish you were here with me. I really need you, brother." He also wrote a letter at the time to his good friend Jack Bullock stating that he had received threatening letters in the mail and was scared for his life. We also know that not long before this tragedy happened, he went out and bought a handgun. He kept it loaded with him on his person at all times. So he was obviously afraid of something, we just don't know what or who. Based on all the evidence, I think that these crimes happened the 3 weeks in between Harry's first visit and his second. We also know that Jim's crops were not going to be ready for cutting until mid-January of 1918. Harry reported seeing those crops cut when he visited on 22nd of January. If we assume that Jim and John were the ones that cut the crops, that means the crime had to have happened between Harry's first visit on the 22nd and his one in February, 3 weeks later. It's not an answer, but it does narrow it down since the men were last seen December 21st of 1917, over a month prior. The other thing is, as much information as we have on Jim Barkley and his past, that's how little information we have on John. The only thing I could find was his death certificate registration number 1443, which lists his death as between December 21st of 1917 and January 22nd of 1918. We know he was roughly 61 years old when Jim Barkley hired him at the station. Of course, we know that both men met with foul play. It is also very odd that it was a different weapon and they were found in different locations. Over the last 105 years, there have been several people that have confessed to it on their deathbeds to their loved ones, and then those people have then passed it on, and the story has just gotten more and more distorted. I think Harry Smith may have known more than he was letting on. I don't necessarily think he was involved. I just think that based on certain events, He also had a very rough past. At one point, one of his sisters disappeared and was never seen again. In 1885, one of his half-brothers was working in a tunnel and lost one of his legs. Plus, he went through that whole thing with his mother, leaving his father. Of course, like I said earlier, she died during childbirth when she was giving birth to the twin sisters. He changed his name to Harry Smith, and when asked, he said he didn't even remember his birth father. He stayed in that same homestead in Eaglevale up until his death in 1945. Maybe some of the secrets died with him. Maybe he never knew anything. Maybe there's someone out there that still does know something, a descendant, who knows? In 1988, the Wonnangatta Station became part of Alpine National Park. It is only accessible by four-wheel drive vehicles, horseback, dirt bikes, or on foot. It has camping facilities such as vault toilets and fire rings. It's a very popular place for people to go and camp and off-road. I would definitely love to hear your thoughts and comments, any theories you have on this crazy mystery. Like I said, there are so many theories, several books. I'll have a lot of that information in the description if you care to do any further reading. Thank you all for watching. I appreciate all your feedback, your support, your comments. Special thank you to co.ag for providing the background music. Hopefully I'll see you all in the next one. Take care. Hey everyone, thanks for sticking with me to the end. This is definitely a very mysterious case, and like I said, it's still unsolved to this day. I would definitely love to hear any of your thoughts. At certain points in the video, in the beginning, when I was discussing the Bryce family and William and Hannah, there's no evidence of them ever being married or a marriage certificate. That's why I just said that they were partners, but they were definitely in a relationship. Jim Barclay's son, or young Jim, was later questioned by a reporter or book writer and asked about what he thought. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that it was so long ago and both perpetrators are dead, I really don't have anything to say. Thank you again for watching. If you haven't subscribed, please consider subscribing. It's free and really helps the channel. I'm working on some recent missing hiker cases and should have those videos up shortly.